All right. Time for the weigh-in here on the Monday Morning Ask. A lot of times I get up here and I just sort of shout with righteous indignation. I do not wish to do that today, partly because I don't feel like it, in part because I know you don't want to hear it. But we got to talk about that Chuck fight, right? What do you want to say about that? There were a lot of things you could say about that. There's any number of different angles you could pick. Here's the one I want to pick out because I just think it's the most important one to talk about at the opening of the show, which is about retirement. Now, on the Monday Morning Analyst, I'm going to talk about the fight itself and what lessons we can infer from that. But we always run up into this argument, right? You can never tell a person to retire. Never is the operative word there. You can never tell another person to retire. And I really have never agreed with that for a lot of reasons. But I think the way I wanted to open this part of the show and in this conversation more generally is I think that at the heart of it, that's probably the correct sentiment. It's just too restrictive. In other words, how many times in MMA, particularly like the heavier weight classes, how many times in MMA have you thought that somebody was absolutely no doubt about it done, and they came back and showed you, yeah, maybe not, maybe not. Maybe they got something left here, right? That's one truth you have to consider. Think about this weekend. Alistair Overeem was like, I'm back. I think he was dealing with some thoughts about, how much time at the top do I have left? How much time in the sport do I have left? And I think he found that win over the weekend very rejuvenating. Even Francis Ngannou, right? Some folks were like, we're going to see what he's got left. I mean, it's not really clear how much is really there. And he showed you that it was not anywhere close to being done, probably. I've made that mistake with other fighters before that I thought was like, yeah, they're for sure done. And then they really weren't. The truth of it is, you do have to be extremely careful, and you do have to have some humility about knowing when someone's at the end. And it is kind of hard to tell, to be perfectly honest with you. All evidence for many, many years will indicate that something is true, and then it can just turn. You have to just be very careful. But I also feel like, at the same time, while having a degree of humility about it is probably the right idea, I think it's also the right idea to just take away that word never. You can never tell another man or woman when to retire. Really, never. They can be 70 and they're fighting, and that's okay. I mean, I suppose that there'll be some exception in the future, right, where someone can be 70 and fight, but the point still stands. That, to me, is just way too restrictive. It is true that you can tell someone to retire. It is not merely true. It is frankly a moral requirement at some point, right? I mean, here was the big issue for me in that Chuck fight. It wasn't that he got knocked out, although that's not great, but people get knocked out in fights all the time. So that by itself is not a big deal. And he wasn't fighting some, marauding crusader, which I guess in some ways makes it worse. But at the same time, he wasn't like it was like the risk of abuse was super high. So that's fine. But here was the issue for me. It was that after 10 years, all of the things that made you want to say this is why he should be done, none of them were rolled back at all. Like they were all still in play. His ability to take damage, chief among them. It seems to be as compromised as it ever was. I'm sure Tito hits hard, but relative to his peers in his era, he was not known as a particularly hard puncher. He was known as like a volume ground and pounder. And he was just putting Chuck on roller skates several times in this contest, including at the very end, doing it in under a round. Like there was no pullback from that, right? There have been times where folks have questioned other people's chins, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, actually, maybe it's a little bit better. But there was no improvement here. I think physically he didn't look good at all in the way in which he moved, and for the reasons he was trying to set up offense. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But my point only is the following. It's like, if you can't at least think to yourself, this is not a good idea for somebody in that circumstance, well, then I guess, yeah, never is the appropriate word. I guess if even a case like that where someone is clearly not capable of fighting even someone of their own generation who also is right at retirement, then you can't really say it at all. But that clearly seems imbecilic and a very bad idea. Like, if we're going to preserve this combat sports, this MMA, we have to have a degree of, as I mentioned before, humility about it. We have to have a degree of sober perspective about it. But we also have to have a degree of humanity, not merely in granting opportunity, but in pulling it away as well. It's a two-way street. For as many times as you want to give someone an opportunity, you have to deny it probably at the other end as well in order to preserve health, safety, standards, appearance, and everything in between. It actually can't work if you just let it be whatever. It's why we have rules. It's why it's regulated. It's why there's oversight. It's why that there's selection in terms of who can be in the cage and who can't, who can fight at the highest level and who can't. There's all kinds of rules and mechanisms and everything else in place. You actually have to have that for this thing to function. It's not merely that you saw a legend go down, it doesn't make you feel good. That's part of it. The other part is, like, I don't think that this thing deserves to exist if we let more of this happen. You have to at some point say, yeah, no, you kind of can't tell someone to retire. They don't have to necessarily listen. In fact, I have no power over them. As you heard me on my live chat before, I've made this argument. I can't twist their arm. I can't make them. But at some point, man, if you're watching something like that and you don't say anything, I don't know. I don't think that's an opportunity to be sitting on the sidelines. I think it's an opportunity to say, because we care and because we have respect and because we need this operation to function at a level that frankly is palatable to society, palatable to our ethics, palatable to our sense of humanity, sometimes you just got to say no. And it doesn't feel good, and I don't think it should. But this idea that we should never intervene, that we should never say anything, I think that's a recipe for disaster, and it's not really fair to the fighters who are programmed and have been programmed all their lives to think a certain way. You're actually doing them a disservice. All right, that's my way in.